By 1980, the Australian car industry had talked itself into believing the hard years were behind it. The oil crisis was fading, the Japanese competition was manageable, and the big three, Holden, Ford, Chrysler, had survived the 70s battered but breathing. What came next was 10 years that proved the optimism completely wrong. This is a countdown of the 10 worst cars sold in Australia through the 1980s, 10 to 1. And the one sitting at number 1 still surprises people when they learn the full story. It won the country's most prestigious automotive award. Then Monash University quietly proved it was significantly worse than average in a crash. That story is coming. Let's count down. Number 10. The 1986 Holden Piazza. On paper, and honestly, on paper only, the Holden Piazza was genuinely exciting. Designed by Giorgetto Giugiaro, the Italian maestro behind the original Volkswagen Golf and the Lotus Esprit, it arrived in Australian showrooms in 1986, wearing a genuinely striking body, pop-up headlights, a swooping roofline, Star Wars-style digital instruments, and a single wiper blade that sped up as the car accelerated. Holden called it Australia's first turbocharged production car. At $34,500 at launch, it sat in serious sports car territory. The problem was the foundation it was built on. Beneath that sculpted Italian shell sat the chassis of the Isuzu Gemini, a car that had debuted in the mid-70s and was already elderly by the time the Piazza arrived. The rear suspension was a solid axle setup, the kind of arrangement that made the car behave unpredictably under hard braking, with the back wheels prone to locking before the fronts. Motoring journalists of the period were diplomatic about it. Reading between the lines, they were alarmed. A few hundred Australians bought one, mostly on the strength of how it looked in the driveway. Most of them discovered, on the first proper corner at speed, that 7-year-old Gemini geometry and 110 kilowatts do not mix well. The Piazza was gone from Australian showrooms by 1988. Holden never mentioned it again. But the car at number 9 involved someone considerably more famous and considerably more humiliated. Number 9. The 1988 Lada Samara. After his very public falling out with Holden over the infamous energy polarizer device, an episode that ended his long partnership with the brand, Peter Brock needed something to do. What he found was Lada. The Russian manufacturer had decided that Australia was a market worth entering, and they bought Brock's former HDT workshop at Bertie Street in Melbourne to use as their local operation. Brock's role was officially described as pre-delivery, checking the Samara hatchbacks as they arrived from the docks and preparing them for Australian roads. In practice, pre-delivery became a diplomatic term for fixing the build quality that had survived the Soviet factory, but not quite the journey south. The body gaps on early Samaras were visible from a distance. The wiring had to be remedied before the cars were street legal. And despite Brock's involvement and a limited edition Samara Brock Deluxe variant with revised suspension, the cars remained what they fundamentally were: cheap Russian transport, built to a price point that assumed buyers had very modest expectations. Around 6,000 were modified under the Brock arrangement, but even his reputation couldn't shift enough of them. The Lada operation in Australia lasted until the mid-90s. For Brock, it was a period he didn't discuss much in later interviews. What comes at number 8 managed to embarrass two companies at once, which takes some doing. Number 8. The 1989 Ford Corsair. The 1980s was a decade of unusual automotive alliances in Australia, driven largely by government pressure to rationalise the local industry. The Button Plan, named after Industry Minister John Button, forced manufacturers to collaborate or consolidate. Some of those partnerships produced reasonable cars. The Ford Corsair was not one of them. Ford Australia and Nissan found themselves sharing production at Nissan's Clayton plant in Melbourne. Nissan built their version first, the Pintara, which was effectively a local version of the Nissan Bluebird. Ford then took the same car, gave it a different grille, called it the Corsair, and sent it to Ford dealerships. Most buyers could tell immediately. The car wore a blue oval badge but felt unmistakably Japanese, not in the best sense of precise engineering, but in the sense of unfamiliar ergonomics in a Falcon showroom, steering that felt nothing like any Falcon that had come before, and a 2.4-litre four-cylinder that delivered its 85 kilowatts without any particular enthusiasm. Ford loyalists who walked in expecting something from Broadmeadows walked back out again. The Corsair lasted 3 years. Ford sold fewer than 8,000 of them total. The Pintara, at least, had the advantage of wearing the right badge for what it was. Number 7. the 1986 Nissan Pintara. Since we're here, the Pintara itself deserves a mention, because while the Corsair was a stranger in the wrong showroom, the Pintara was simply a car that arrived a year after Mitsubishi's Magna had reset expectations in its class and never recovered from the comparison. Built at Nissan's Clayton plant, the R31 Pintara ran a 2.0-litre four-cylinder producing 78 kilowatts, respectable for its era, and came as a sedan or wagon. It was neat, inoffensive, and assembled to a reasonable standard. Contemporary road tests were polite about it. They were also polite about dental waiting rooms, and for similar reasons. Few people remember how high Nissan's ambitions were for the Pintara and its successor. The company had invested heavily in the Clayton plant, eyeing export targets of up to 50,000 vehicles a year. The plan was to make the Pintara a genuine volume success in Australia before selling it into markets as far away as Europe. What they hadn't planned for was being directly compared, side by side in dealerships, against the Mitsubishi Magna and Toyota Camry, both of which offered more room, more refinement, and more of everything an Australian family actually wanted. Pintara sales fell year after year, until Nissan pulled the plug in 1992. The Clayton plant closed 3 years later. We're halfway through the list, and the number one car, the one that won Car of the Year and was later found to be dangerously below average in a crash, is still coming. Stay with me. Number 6. The 1984 Holden VK Commodore. The VK Commodore arrived in February 1984, with Holden's marketing team calling it world-class. That phrase is a useful guide to how nervous the company was. When you're confident, you don't need to say it. The problem was the engine. The six-cylinder sitting under the VK's bonnet was a direct descendant of the unit introduced in the EH Holden in 1963. It was iron-blocked, overhead valve, and by the mid-80s, it had been coaxed, tweaked, and breathed on until it was producing 86 kilowatts in base form, respectable for 1963, exhausted by 1984. Optional electronic fuel injection lifted output to 106 kilowatts, which sounded better than it felt in practice. Worse, Holden already knew the engine was doomed. The 1986 unleaded fuel mandate was coming, and the old Iron 6 could not meet it. The VK was built while the company scrambled to find a solution, which eventually came from Nissan of all places. So the VK Commodore was the last Holden with Australia's original engine, produced by a company that had already privately acknowledged it was a dead end. Buyers who didn't know this paid full price for a car that was, effectively, Holden's farewell to an era. That's not necessarily the car's fault, but it explains why the VK, for all its decent bones, carries a slight air of desperation in retrospect. And the next car carried not desperation, but genuine, bewildering confusion about what it was trying to be. Number 5. The 1985 Mitsubishi Magna TM. The first-generation Mitsubishi Magna landed in 1985 with genuine promise. It was a wide-body, locally built family car, engineered at Mitsubishi's Tonsley Park plant in Adelaide, with a 2.6-litre four-cylinder under the bonnet and enough interior space to compete seriously with the Commodore and Falcon. It won Wheels magazine's Car of the Year for 1985. Within months of that award, the transmissions started failing. Here's a detail that doesn't get mentioned enough. The automatic gearbox in early TM Magnas was so problematic that many owners had the entire unit replaced under warranty, and then had the replacement fail too. One documented case, entered into the public record years later, shows an automatic gearbox that self-destructed at 18,000 kilometers, was replaced, slipped again at 36,000, was repaired, suffered an electronic overdrive failure at 64,000, and required a complete third gearbox. The same car also went through 2 timing chains and a cylinder head. Mitsubishi eventually sorted the transmission. Later Magna generations were considerably better cars, but the TM earned a reputation early that followed the nameplate for years, unfairly contaminating the improved cars that came after it. It's one of Australian motoring's quiet injustices, a promising wide-body car that could have changed the conversation, undermined by components that simply weren't ready for the roads they were sent onto. But if the Magna's problems were mechanical, the car at number 4 had a problem that was more fundamental than any single faulty part. Number 4. The 1989 Holden Apollo. After 7 years of the Camira, which we'll get to, Holden desperately needed a replacement. What they arrived at was the Apollo, a badge-engineered version of the Toyota Camry, produced through a joint venture called United Australian Automobile Industries. The underlying car was excellent. The Toyota Camry was one of the most reliable, well-engineered family sedans in the world. Holden's version had a different grille, different badging, and slightly different trim levels. That was essentially it. The problem wasn't the car, it was the situation. Holden spent its brochure pages insisting the Apollo was genuinely Australian. The word Australian appeared in nearly every paragraph of the launch material, a quantity that suggested considerable anxiety. Buyers who walked into a Holden dealer to look at the Apollo and walked across the road to a Toyota dealer to look at the Camry quickly understood that they were looking at the same car. The Toyota badge, reasonably enough, suggested better resale value and a dealer network that had been selling this exact vehicle without the identity complications. The Apollo did fine. It was never going to be a disaster, but it represented something hollower than fine. A badge on a car Holden hadn't designed, hadn't engineered, and hadn't built, sold to people who'd grown up thinking Holden meant something Australian. Some of those people noticed, and some of them never quite forgave it. Number 3. The 1988 Ford EA Falcon. Ford Australia spent more than $700 million developing the EA Falcon. When it arrived in March 1988, it genuinely looked like the future, a smooth, rounded body that replaced the hard edges of the XD XF series, flush glass, fuel-injected engines, and advertising that showed the car rising from the surface of a lake in slow motion. Simply stunning, the tagline said. Within months, the head gaskets started going. The engineering explanation is specific and fascinating. The EA's inline-six had a long alloy head bolted to an iron block. As the engine cycled through heat and cold, the alloy expanded and contracted at a different rate to the iron below it, and this differential movement gradually filed away at the head gasket seal. Cars that were started frequently in short bursts without reaching full operating temperature were particularly vulnerable. For a country where many families use their car for school runs and shopping, this was a meaningful proportion of buyers. There were also loose steering column adjusters, warped door stampings that made for imprecise panel gaps, and interior fittings, mirror mounts, window winders that fell off in the hand. Ford worked steadily to improve the car through its production run, and the EB that replaced it in 1991 was a much better machine, but the EA had launched on a wave of expectation, and it broke that wave. Was your family's Falcon an EA? I'd genuinely like to know how it held up. Leave a comment. Number 2. The 1989 Ford Corsair and Nissan Pintara were bad, but number 2 was supposed to be Holden's salvation. Let me tell you about the Holden VL Commodore's engine situation first, because it sets the scene for what comes next. When the VL arrived in 1986, Holden had swapped out the old Iron 6 for a Nissan RB30E, a jewel of an overhead cam, fuel-injected 3.0-litre that had been developed for the Australian-built Nissan Skyline. It was genuinely excellent, but Nissan Australia was not pleased about Holden's marketing material, which referred to the engine as Commodore's all-new 6-cylinder PowerTech 6i engine, as if Holden had built it themselves. Nissan ran their own ads in response, noting pointedly that if you like the engine in the Commodore, you might try it in the car for which it was actually designed. More ruinously, the yen-to-dollar exchange rate moved against Holden. The Nissan engine that had been costed at one price when the deal was struck was arriving at more than twice that price by the time the cars were being assembled. The VL, which should have been profitable, was bleeding money with every car sold. Combined with the Camira's ongoing losses, it pushed Holden to the brink of bankruptcy in the late 1980s. The VL itself was a fine car. The broader situation it revealed, Holden buying engines from a rival because they couldn't afford to build their own, was not fine at all. And now, number 1. Number 1. The 1982 Holden Camira JB. August 1982. Holden launched the Camira from their Elizabeth plant in South Australia with the kind of confidence that comes from having spent $400 million on a car and needing it to work. It was Holden's first front-wheel drive car, first of GM's global J-body platform in Australia. Modern in ways no Holden had been before. Transverse engine, rack and pinion steering, European-style proportions. Wheels magazine drove it and named it Car of the Year for 1982. Then the cars reached customers, and the letters started arriving. The doors rusted. Not eventually, quickly. Engineers had neglected to put drainage holes in the door cavities, meaning that any moisture that found its way inside had no way out. It pooled. It sat. It ate the panels from the inside. Owners would notice a small bubble in the door skin, press it, and find it gave way. The engines smoked. Early JB units had oil consumption problems that put a blue haze out the exhaust from the first few months of ownership. Holden's new four-cylinder required a completely different driving style to the sixes Australians were used to. It needed to be revved to produce useful power, and Australian buyers, mostly accustomed to pulling from low revs, found it either unresponsive or burning oil, depending on how they drove it. Air conditioning caused overheating. The cooling system in early Camiras fitted with air conditioning couldn't manage the additional heat load. On hot days, in Australia, a significant operational category, the temperature gauge climbed and climbed. Paint failed. The finish on early Camiras was notoriously thin and began deteriorating quickly under the Australian sun. And then, years later, Monash University's Accident Research Centre published a finding that landed quietly but should have been front-page news. The Holden Camira, measured against other medium cars of its era, provided a level of crash protection that was, in their words, significantly worse than average. Not slightly below, significantly worse. In a crash, a Camira was one of the least safe places you could be. Holden improved the car through the JD and JE series, and the later Camiras were genuinely better. But 85,000 JBs had been sold before those improvements arrived. 85,000 cars, each with doors that couldn't drain, engines that smoked, and a body that crumpled before it should have. The Camira was discontinued in 1989. 151,807 were built in total, and it remains, to this day, the car most commonly cited when Australians are asked to name the worst thing Holden ever did. These cars are worth remembering, and not just as cautionary tales. They're the record of a decade when Australian manufacturers were being asked to do too much with too little, modernize their platforms, meet new emissions rules, survive Japanese competition, and keep prices low enough that ordinary families could reach them. Every car on this list was a genuine attempt to solve a real problem. Most of them just solved it badly. What sticks with me, looking at the full picture of the 1980s, is how close the whole industry came to collapse. Holden nearly went under, Nissan closed Clayton, Ford's golden launch turned to lead. And yet the Commodore survived into the next decade, the Magna found its feet, and the Falcon kept on. Something about the stubbornness of Australian motoring culture, the refusal to simply give up on locally built cars, kept the industry breathing when it probably should have quit. Was there a car from this list in your family's driveway? A Camira that always ran a little blue, or an EA Falcon whose head gasket your dad swore about on a Sunday morning? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this kind of story is what you're here for, a like and subscribe to Sunburnt Chrome goes a long way. There's plenty more where this came from.